Most Yu-Gi-Oh decks are centered around a specific archetype, designed to work with itself and other generic cards, but mostly constructed that archetypes cards. Decks like Snake Eyes, Fire King, Blackwings, and along etcetera fit this description. Then there's decks that are focused around specific archetypes that make use of non-archetypal cards to certain extents. This includes Orcust, Tearlaments, Eldlich, and others. But then there's this weird sub-archetype of decks that make use of a majority of non-archetypal cards. These decks were plenty more common early in the game's history, before archetypes became as encompassing as they are now. Strategies such as Frog Monarchs, Disaster Dragon, or Tengu Plants are examples of this. Decks that are built on loose synergies between cards instead of written in stone effects and interactions like most modern decks. One of these decks is also one of the oldest, Counter Fairies. As you can guess by the name alone, Counter Fairies is a deck centered around using counter traps in tandem with fairy monsters. This might sound great at first, since some of the game's strongest cards are counter traps. Cards like Solemn Judgment and Solemn Strike are well-known members of this subtype, and they earn their fame from the strong effects. The issue comes when, if your deck is dedicated to generic cards, what's stopping other, better decks from using those generic cards? Tracking the start of the Counter Fairy deck is kind of an issue because, as we discussed earlier, it didn't come out as an archetype of cards with a common naming convention. We can instead essentially pinpoint two different possible points of appearances for the deck's first cards: 2004's Legacy of Darkness for the release of Air Knight Parshath, or 2006 Enemy of Justice with the release of a myriad of cards, most importantful, Bountiful Artemis. If we take Legacy of Darkness as a starting point, since the Parshath archetype is closely related to Counter Fairies, we run into an issue of, well, not having a Counter Fairy deck. So let's take a look at when the theme really started in Enemy of Justice. This set gave us a few fairies that would start off the Counter Fairy deck. Some playable, some not so much. Just so we get them out of the way first, this set introduced Herald of Green Light, Herald of Purple Light, as well as Banisher of Radiance. These are somewhat designed to work with the rest of the fairies of the set, but don't really interest us when talking about counter fairies. What we're here for is actually Bountiful Artemis, Layer the Liberator, and Voltanus the Adjudicator. These cards all interact with counter traps in different and very interesting ways. Bountiful Artemis is the deck's main star, and has remained as such until the modern iterations of the deck. As a level 4, it allows you to draw a card immediately after a counter trap is resolved. The biggest issue counter traps have is the fact that they don't do all that well in terms of card advantage. Yes, their effects are very powerful, but they're all 1-for-1 trades, meaning you don't actually get any card advantage from using their effects. Bountiful Artemis changes that, making all of your counter traps 2-for-1s in terms of card advantage, getting you a +1 in all your plays. Layer the Liberator has a similar utility in trying to gain you advantage when using counter traps, but instead of drawing cards, it returns 2 banished fairies to your hand. Not quite as good, is it? Throw in the fact that it's 200 attack points below Bountiful Artemis, and you're left with a card that is simply subpar. Designed to ideally work with Banisher of the Radiance as well to get fairies into the banishment, Layard will only be liberating you from winning. Last but certainly not least, we have Voltanus the Adjudicator. This level 8 fairy can summon itself from your hand by tributing all monsters you control immediately after resolving a counter trap. If summoned this way, it then allows you to destroy cards your opponent controls equal to the number of fairies you tributed. Voltanus was an exceedingly powerful card for its time. The ability to bring out a 2800 attack body after spending your counter trap, stopping your opponent, and also disrupting your opponent in such an explosive way makes Voltanus the Adjudicator one of the best tools the deck had access to for the longest time. To understand the next wave of support, we need to explain a pretty weird event that happened around 2007. As you probably already know, Konami does remakes of past structure decks consistently. Stuff like Structure Deck Emperor of Darkness being a remake of Structure Deck the Dark Emperor, Dino Smasher's Fury, a remake of Dinosaur's Rage, and so on and so on. You might also know that we sometimes do not get these remastered structure decks, and instead have the cards inserted into some other products. This happened with the Gemini, Dragunity, and Agent structure decks, which got packed into several different sets, more likely because of the low sales those structure decks had in the OCG. However, the opposite has also happened. That is, us getting the remastered structure deck and not the original. The Layer of Darkness structure deck was a remake of the original Curse of Darkness structure deck, which did not release in the TCG, meaning that important cards like Recurrent Nightmare and Eradicate Epidemic Virus had to be released in a different manner. What Konami somehow thought was the best way of giving them to the TCG was printing them in core sets as secret rares. Yeah, and I don't mean just the good ones like the ones we just mentioned, I mean all of the new cards, meaning that you could pull a secret rare of Sword of Dark Rites from the Force of the Breaker. The set which included all the cards from the structure deck, but we obviously don't care about Diabolos. So why are we talking about this? Well, the Diabolos structure deck was meant to have a light counterpart in the Surge of Radiance structure deck. This fairy-centric deck was also dismantled and printed into a core set, so Strike of Neos was now riddled with absolutely unplayable secret rares that would certainly ruin your day if you pulled them. Cards like Duo and Aegis of Gaia are certainly not what you want to pull in your set with Dark World, Grandmaster the Six Samurai, and a bunch of more great cards. The ones we care about are a decent amount of secret rares that bloat the set, starting with Neo Parshath the Sky Paladin. Okay, I lied, we don't really care about this guy just yet, but it's important to take a look at him now to understand later support. It's essentially a bigger version of Air Knight Parshath, which can special summon itself from your hand by tributing the original, and gains attack equal to the difference in life points if the Sanctuary of the Sky is on the field. By this point, Air Knight Parshath had stopped being the powerhouse it was during GOAT format, and an upgraded version of him was not really relevant. What we care about is his interaction with the Sanctuary in the Sky, as that'll be very important part of the Counter Fairy strategy in the future. In this same set, we received a Nova Summoner, a fairy version of the recruiters like Mystic Tomato and Shining Angel, which could summon Air Knight Parshath if you control the Sanctuary of the Sky. Sadly, it missed out on summoning Bountiful Artemis by 100 attack points, so we don't really care about it. Freya, Spirit of Victory, acts as a weak little attack increase which can protect itself from combat, but her tiny 400 attack boost is not going to do much. What we care most about is the level 4 Harvest Angel of Wisdom. This 1800 attack beater can return any counter trap from your graveyard to your hand when it's destroyed by battle and sent to the grave, giving the deck some actual recursion. The fact it needs to be destroyed by battle to actually recur resources is unfortunate, but it's better than nothing. The next inclusion to the deck was not a fairy, but a continuous trap of all things. Synthetic Seraphim allows you to special summon a Synthetic Seraphim token every time a counter trap card is resolved, giving you some small bodies to protect yourself. This is alright, obviously too slow nowadays, but a decent inclusion for the deck at the time. The next fairy to make the cut was actually a good one at last. Meltiel, Sage of the Sky, is level 4 with 1600 attack that gains 1000 life points every time a counter trap resolves, and destroys a card if the Sanctuary of the Sky is on the field. This is actually pretty alright. Meltiel gives you a life point buffer, which is really important since several counter traps have a life point cost, most importantly among them Solemn Judgment. These nice words cannot be said of our next card, however. A member of the Dark archetype, Dark Voltanis, is the darker version of Voltanis the Adjudicator. It can special summon itself from your hand by tributing a dark monster after a counter trap is resolved, then destroy a card on the field. You might have come to realize that all monsters we've covered so far have been a light. Not only that, but when Dark Voltanis released, there were a total of 7 Dark Fairy monsters, including itself. So yeah, not really gonna see this guy around much. The last card Counter Fairies would receive is, however, a much more interesting and powerful piece. Vandalgion, the Dark Dragon Lord, is a level 8 Dark Dragon. This isn't even a fairy, and it's still one of the strongest cards Counter Fairies had access to at the time. It can special summon itself from your hand if you negate the activation of a card with a counter trap, and then does something else based on what type of card you negated. If you negated a spell, you burn your opponent for 1500 damage. If you negated a trap, you target a card and destroy it. If you negated a monster effect, you revive a monster from your grave. All of this on a 2800 attack body. Not only is Vandalgion Counter Fairy's strongest card at the time, it's also one of the coolest cards ever. And more impressively, it's the only Counter Fairy card to ever win a premier event. Indeed, 2 copies of the Dark Dragon Lord were in the side deck of Jonathan Moore's Six Samurai list that won the SJC Houston 2008. You probably know Jonathan Moore from the YouTube channel House of Champs, and he made a very smart use of Vandalgion in tandem with 3 Solemn Judgments in the main, with Pulling the Rug and Spell Shield Type 8 in the side to complement them. Not just that, Vandalgion accompanied Counter Fairies to their only top in history. During the 2008 Canadian Nationals, Counter Fairies sneaked into the top 8 in a field dominated by Gladiator Bees and Dark Arm Dragon decks. This deck made use of a control shell filled with light monsters like Raikou the Lightsworn Hunter and Arcana Force Zero the Fool to slow down the playing field in order to make your counter traps have much more impact. But sadly, after that one top, the deck fell into obscurity. A lack of support and the speed of the game was starting to make Counter Fairies fall to the wayside and be forgotten. That was until 2016 rolled around, and with it came the release of Breakers of Shadow, one of the best core sets in the game's history. With it, we received Guiding Ariadne. This level 4 pendulum monster has some of the strongest effects the Counter Fairy deck could want. As a pendulum spell, it makes it so you don't have to pay life points or discard cards to activate counter trap cards. This is very important since most counter traps have steep costs to make up for their powerful effects. This meant that Solemn Judgment, Solemn Warning, and Solemn Strike were essentially free counters, as well as the newly released Ultimate Providence, which could really turn the card from mediocre to truly powerful. However, Ariadne's monster effect is what really pushed the card to the forefront of meta decks. When Guiding Ariadne is destroyed in any way, it allows you to reveal 3 counter traps from your deck, to then make your opponent choose one to add to your hand and shuffle the rest back into the deck. This might seem like a slow effect, since Counter Fairies have no way of destroying Ariadne in a reliable way, and almost seems like you're expected to wait for it to be destroyed in battle or something. But that's not what players did with the card. Not at all. Instead, they decided to throw into a pendulum deck you might be familiar with, Pepe. This strategy has gone on to be recognized as one of the strongest decks in the game's history, and for good reason. But the deck is not why we're here today. Instead, we need to look at the absolute burst and card advantage that comes from destroying your guiding Ariadne with Performer-Pal Pendulum Sorcerer. When Sorcerer is special summoned, it can target up to 2 cards you control and destroy them to search for more Performer-Pal monsters. I'm sure you're getting the picture by now. Scale Ariadne, destroy with Sorcerer, search Performer-Pal Extenders, and Solemn Strike. This ability to search a card as strong as Solemn Strike as part of your base combo was an essential element in Pepe's success, and for good reason. But sadly, while Guiding Ariadne is the card with the most success in Counter Fairies' arsenal, the success did not come from the deck we're talking about today. Now we finally get to the payoff for the structure deck tangent we went over before. Structure deck Wave of Light. This structure deck was the remastered version of the OCG exclusive Surge Radiant structure deck from all the way back in 2006, and with it came a new focus: counter traps. Counter Fairies had been a deck with a few good tools. Bountiful Artemis is definitely a very strong card, which many decks wish they had access to with their own archetypes, and counter traps themselves are obviously super strong. But the deck lacked a legitimate boss monster. Sure, Vandalgion is good and cool, but the boss monster of a deck called Counter Fairies being a dark dragon does not make quite a lot of sense. To remedy this, we received the level 9 fairy, Sacred Arc Air Knight Parshath. This beefy 2000 attack body can summon itself from your hand or graveyard by banishing 2 fairies whenever you activate a counter trap or negate the activation of opponent's card or effect. It is the usual Parshath stick dealing piercing damage, but instead of drawing a card when it deals damage, it searches for a Parshath card or a counter trap directly from your deck. This card was not very good. You still need to play it, it still kinda sucks. Why, you may ask? Because getting a decently sized body that constantly comes back is absolutely crazy in a deck that passes on a 1600 attack monster 90% of the time. The ability to search for counter traps or Parshath cards is decent, but it still needs you to have access to it, negate a card, and then have an attack connect. Sadly, that doesn't pass in 2024 Yu-Gi-Oh! And it barely passed in 2017 Yu-Gi-Oh! When this card was released. But what even are you meant to search with its battle phase effect? You might very reasonably ask. Well, an actually good card. Remember how some of the cards we talked about before needed the Sanctuary of the Sky to apply certain effects? Well, the Sanctum of Parshath is the Sanctuary in the Sky. While on the field, or in the graveyard at least, this continuous spell does a lot for the deck, honestly. It makes all fairy monsters gain 300 attack and defense, and makes it so set spells and traps cannot be destroyed or targeted by card effects. Lastly, as a once per turn, it can place 3 fairies and or counter traps in your graveyard on top of your deck, as a way of recycling powerful cards. This card is alright, it's fine, nothing crazy, but the protection comes in clutch. Being able to not waste a perfectly good Solemn Judgment on a Harpy's Feather Duster is a very good reason to run the card at all. But the fact that the last effect doesn't shuffle 3 to draw a card is still spit in the face. But this is not the only card our new friend Parshath can search. Rebirth of Parshath is a counter trap which can negate any spell, trap, or activation of a monster effect, shuffle it back into the deck. That at the low cost of revealing a counter trap from your hand, then discarding 1 card, then paying 1000 life points. Oh, and it also summons a Parshath monster from your main or extra deck after that. Yeah, you really need to have Guiding Ariadne out to actually justify a cost this steep. Still, the effect itself is great. Shuffling back whatever you negate is actually one of the strongest elements of the card. Being able to get around graveyard effects or recursion, and getting a guy for free is always welcome. In this structure deck, we also received 2 actually playable normal monsters. First is Minerva, Scholar of the Sky. This is a level 4 with 1700 attack that gains a 500 attack permanent buff after a counter trap resolves, and then adds a counter trap with a different name from your graveyard to your hand if the Sanctuary of the Sky is on the field. The 500 attack boost adds up pretty quickly, and the fact that it's a permanent gain makes Minerva one of the strongest tools the deck has access to, easily climbing to numbers around the 4000 mark. We also received Power Angel Valkyria, a level 4 1800 attack fairy, which once per turn adds a light fairy monster from your deck to your hand when you get the activation of a spell, trap, or monster effect. This one's the black sheep of the pack. Limiting its effect to only a once per turn is a shot to the kneecaps to any playability the card might have had. Not only that, but it's a hard once per turn limitation, meaning you get no value from having multiple Valkyrias on the field. In a parallel universe, Power Angel Valkyria would be able to fetch negate heralds like the Herald of Orange Light and a fairy to discard so the deck would be playable. But we live in the darkest timeline. Last of the new cards from the structure deck is probably one you all know the best, Eva. This level 1 fairy can, when sent to the graveyard, banish 2 other light fairies from your graveyard to search the same number of level 2 or lower fairies. Eva is currently banned. Drytron setting up Herald of Ultimateness with Eva in hand meant they had access to about 6 negates each turn while also setting up for the next turn. This is not a counter fairy card. Moving on, and that was it. The deck was forgotten about and still is. Sure, we got a couple pieces of support like Celestial Night Lord Parshath, which is a good card, but almost impossible to summon in control deck with no extenders, but is still the best target to summon with Rebirth of Parshath, being able to search fairy monsters and special summon them. There's also Harvest Angel of Doom, a dark pendulum fairy which can destroy itself on your scale to search Black Horn of Heavens, and the original Horn of Heaven on normal or pendulum summon. Sure, why not? This card's good, but not really good enough to justify playing the 14th best counter trap, making it fit a weird spot in deck building. So that's where we are now. Counter Fairies is a completely irrelevant deck with zero shot of having any sort of result at any event, even the lowest tier ones. Fact of the matter is, the deck suffers from overbalancing. Konami saw that Solemn Judgment was banned for like 15 years and thought to themselves, we should never allow something like this to happen again, and screwed over Counter Fairies in the process. The fact that the deck's best card is still its first, even after several ways of support, speaks to Konami's unwillingness to give the deck anything at all. And don't get me wrong, Bountiful Artemis is a good card on its own merits, but it's still the deck's only play. Summon Artemis, set 4, pass. Fun. Now, I'm not saying that control decks are boring, but they really refuse to make Counter Fairies a fun one. Every game plays out the exact same way. You summon a small monster that gets value from counter traps and set counter traps. You then activate said counter traps to hopefully stop your opponent. If you don't, you lose. And if you do, you repeat the same process in the next turn. It's just wildly uninteresting. And some of these cards feel like they were purposefully made to suck just enough. This Sanctum of Parshath not drawing when it recycles, when Prank hits pranks, and similar effects exist which do. Powered Angel Valkyria being a hard once per turn, so you can't do anything interesting with her. Harvest Angel of Doom searching the worst counter traps imaginable. Rebirth of Parshath having a massive cost. The list goes on and on. Some cards are bad in the sense that they can't compete with everything else in the metagame, but these feel actually designed to be bad. And not bad like, yeah, let me cook up this devious deck that makes this crazy combo with vanilla, but just bad. Boring, uninspired effects that just feel designed to not be very good. And sure, counter traps can be very scary. Have you read Gravity Collapse? I get shivers. But do we really care? Yes, actually, we do. Obviously, Konami's in the wrong for breaking their back to ensure that Counter Fairy support sucks in the same year they released Firewall Dragon and Goki. But do we really want the opposite? And this is where the most fundamental issues with counter traps lay. They are uninteractive. This might seem counterintuitive at first, but I'm serious. You might see a card like Solemn Strike and think to yourself, wow, this card promotes strategic timing to use a specific moment in order to gain the upper hand in a duel, and you'd be 100% right. But when your board consists of 5 copies of Solemn Strike, you lose the element of activated in this specific clutch moment, and it just becomes, boy, I sure hope my opponent doesn't have more cards than I do counter traps. And even if you stop your opponent, what then? Are you going to just attack them for 1600 until they're dead? And why not pick up a new hobby instead? Learn a trade, go to school, anything else is a better use of your time. What I mean by this is that the counter traps are an important part of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a design space to fulfill a specific niche. However, the lack of responses they allow makes for an unfun experience when they're the deck's main strategy. And since these cards had to be balanced to not be too game determining in all decks, just shoving 20 of them into your deck list isn't going to do you any favors. But not all is lost. Konami still can make Counter Fairies a proper deck. They just need to do away with the loose light fairy synergy and make them an actual archetype. That way you can print more interesting counter traps that are restricted to the archetype and with more interesting effects than just pay a cost, negate a thing. And maybe then Counter Fairies will be something more than just an utter failure of a strategy. And so that's it for the video. Do you play Counter Fairies? What do you think the deck is missing? What direction would a new wave of support need to make the deck more interesting? Let us know down in the comments below, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one.